Hi, this is Dan Klein for the Econ Journal Watch audio podcast. Today is September 12th, and we're delighted to have today Glenn Diesen from Norway. Hi, Glenn. How are you today?
Oh, very good. Thank you for inviting me on.
We're talking today about Russophobia, historically considered, and why is Econ Journal Watch doing that? It's because we're reprinting Richard Cobden's remarkable pamphlet from 1836 about Russia. And my friend Alberto Mingardi handed me this pamphlet, and I was fascinated by it. And I proceeded to make an abridgment of it, which we're publishing in the issue. And since we do a lot of history of classical liberal thought, I thought it was suitable enough. The Cobden piece is remarkable in the way it talks about, it pushes against what's called Russophobia in the piece. And as it happens, our guest, Glenn Diesen, has written a book lately on Russophobia in 2022, Russophobia, Propaganda in International Politics. So I thought we would talk a little bit about Cobden as a point of departure and just really give you an opportunity to talk about this historically considered. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds great. No, I think probably Cobden is a good point of departure as well. So
Cool. Let me also mention that Professor Diesen's more recent book is called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order. I have had the benefit of watching numerous discussions of the book, and it certainly sounds very fascinating, although I can't say I've yet read the book. But I'm a big fan of Professor Diesen. So Cobden's piece, like I say, appears in the 1836, and I've learned, and you know better than me, that this period was treated by J.H. Gleason in a book called The Genesis of Russophobia in Great Britain, published in 1950 by Harvard University Press. He was a history professor in the United States. And he explains, he focuses on this period from 1815 to 1841 as when Russophobia gets its major foothold, and he's saying that it persists ever since. And so kind of the theme here is how we see in Cobden these tendencies, that is to say, in the arguments that Cobden is criticizing and challenging, we see these tendencies of thought that have persisted ever since. So let me just turn it to you for a second. Maybe we'll get back to a little bit of the Cobden, but do you have any broad reflections on the persistence of this phenomenon?
well, just the duration of it, how strong it's been for such a long time, and as you pointed out as well, the same themes they keep appearing over and over again. And well, I remember when my book came out a bit over 2 years ago, the main criticism came evidently by people who hadn't read it, but it was effectively the stuff that, well, you're excusing what Russia's doing, you're taking their side effectively. But why it could be good to start with Cobden is because a lot of the issues he addresses is not that the British should dismiss Russia as a challenger, but the fears of Russia, they're exaggerated, and how these fears are used to promote more militarism and justify more imperial ambitions from the British, and effectively arguing that this not crazy, but this excessive Russophobia, it only promotes military solutions when there are workable, peaceful opportunities or solutions to some of these problems. So effectively, this argument that Russophobia, it's not necessarily the friend of the British if it limits its opportunities, reduces the prospect of having any pragmatism in its relationship with Russia. And it's this always the conflict as being the main tool to
Yeah.
counter this Russian threat. And it kind of makes sense if you are able to convince the public that they are your exact opposite, that you're fighting against pure evil, then you can't sit down and find a peace. Usually, military victory is required for peace.
Yeah, and it's exciting for me to see Cobden taking up this development and challenging it, trying to put it in, trying to fight against it right when it's really getting started. All of this raises this kind of broad, looming question of why is there this persistent, deep Russophobia? And I guess that gets into very big geopolitical, great power kind of issues, which I guess we can get to. Let me just share a little bit about the Cobden. He, like we say, here says things that may sound familiar to those following the current conflicts. He says that certain Russophobes are suggesting that Russia is very expansionist and is about to gobble up not only its neighbors, but move into Europe. And we hear this claim of Russian expansionism, today. Again, I think overstated. And Cobden makes the point that they don't pay attention to the fact that expansionism actually weakens the power that expands. And this is one of the ironies that we see and Cobden is hitting on, is Russia is at one hand, at one moment portrayed as very expansionist and dangerous, and then it's portrayed as weak enough to challenge and fight and defeat with considerable ease or certainty. Meanwhile, there's the shoe on the other foot question. In other words, the Russophobes have double standards and don't put the shoe on the other foot. In one respect, with respect to expansionism, he says, meanwhile, what has Britain been up to? And he talks about seizing land from France, Holland, and Spain. He speaks of Gibraltar, the Cape of Good Hope, and Hindustan, which is India. And let me read this. He says, during the last 100 years, so that would be 1736 to 1836, England has, for every square league of territory annexed to Russia, by force, violence, and fraud, appropriated to herself 3. So in other words, he's saying we have seized 3 times in the last 100 years what Russia has taken from others. And Cobden says, and our means have been no less reprehensible. It's not as though ours have actually been justified, righteous, while theirs haven't. He speaks of the tragedy of British interventionism in the politics of Europe. He blames this on princes, diplomats, peers, and generals. He thinks the public is just kind of like led along by propagandists. And he advocates non-intervention in political affairs of other nations, and suggests that if we can kind of maintain free trade and be peaceful and friendly and good neighbors, Britain will find a smooth and deep water, and the rocks, shoals, and hurricanes of foreign war will be escaped. Let me also just note that Gleason starts his book on this period that Cobden's part of in 1815, which is when the Corn Laws was created, which restricted trade with Russia and others. And this was part of, a protectionism, a kind of interest group politics, I'm sure, and put Russia as a kind of enemy, or not a friend anyway, that you want to trade with. And Cobden, he's of course also the great champion of the abolition of the Corn Laws. So Cobden's free trade activity very much interconnect with his anti-militarism, anti-colonialism activity, which is also very, very strongly shared by, of course, his colleague John Bright and other liberals of that period. And let me also say that it also echoes David Hume, Adam Smith, and I would even argue, I don't know this as well, Edmund Burke. in his general tendency, but definitely Smith and Hume. And so, this just relates to the theme of, this so-called worlds-based new order, rules-based international order is often labeled the liberal. But, I have a dog in the fight to not call it liberal. And so I like highlighting here that the great liberals in the original Liberalism 1.0 were quite the contrary, and that what we're calling liberal today is anti-liberal. But anyhow, that's a little bit about Cobden. So do you want to maybe pick up a bit from there or enlarge?
Well, I wanted to add though that the liberals at the time in Britain they were divided on empire itself. So much like liberals today are divided on liberal hegemony. So is empire a good thing in terms of allowing the British to expand the liberal ideals, and also defeat alternatives, while others, of course, look towards the empire as being something that contradicts the ideas of liberalism, so self-determination so it was also back then a division there, but it's interesting. You mentioned this introduction by Cobden that he tried to compare the Russian with the British conquests, because this is something that propaganda and Russophobia are supposed to avoid, that us versus them, that it's not comparable what we do. And one can look at this crisis we now have with the war over Ukraine. Look at the language which is used, which is, this is changes everything since World War II, this kind of aggression. I mean, the way we speak of it, something unacceptable that has to be fought till the end. It's as if we didn't have 20 years of occupation of Afghanistan. We didn't have the invasion of Iraq or Syria or Libya, or it's just it's this whole idea that you shouldn't be able to compare. I mean, I've heard people like Donald Trump actually make this point that the bombing in Ukraine, nothing has been seen like this since World War II. But as was pointed out in Newsweek, the United States bombed Iraq more on the first day than Russia did in Ukraine the first month. So where does this come from, that it's not comparable? And it always goes back to this idea that, well, when we do it, it's to spread freedoms. When Russia does it, it's to destroy freedom through imperialism. So the whole idea is that we shouldn't be able to compare. And it's also this, as you suggested before, this dual language we use. So Russia is always weak and backwards. So we use this language today as well, that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. But at the same time, Russia is this overwhelming force standing at the gate of Europe, ready to consume us anytime. So we're trying to mock Russia as people who are fighting with shovels, but also their hypersonic weapons will and threaten our satellites and everything. So it's we often try to have it both ways, and we also saw this in the rhetoric back in the early 19th century, and it's I also drew comparisons with something that Victor Klemperer wrote. He was Jews surviving the Holocaust, and he was making this point that in the rhetoric of Nazi Germany, they also had this dual language. The Jews were loathed as being weak and inferior, like an insect, but also they were overwhelming threat to civilization. So they were both at the same time, and you see this in this inconsistent rhetoric in the West now as well. So Russia can't take some simple small villages in Ukraine, but if they're able to, they will also take all of Europe, and so none of this necessarily make that much sense. And again, we also make the argument that the Russians can take that Ukraine must really be in NATO, because if Ukraine was in NATO, Russia would never dare to attack. But we must also help Ukraine, because once Russia's taken Ukraine, it will move on and take NATO countries. So none of this really adds up that much. It's mostly based on fueling fear and resentment. But this, when you divide the world into superior and inferior, the inferior is both this backwards, weak, but also a huge threat to everything that civilization represents.
It seems like they really need something to hate, something to direct hatred towards, to unify support for their agenda. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and it's also the assumption of Russian being inherently expansionist. And in all fairness, much of Russian history, they have had expansion as an impulse, often because of well, the geography, if you will, that the space allows them to absorb invaders. But the argument is also, if Russia is expansionist, then this requires us to always seek unity against the Russians. And this is quite interesting, because unity within us, creating a new in-group, often is required against the out-group. So with the Russians, we saw this manifest itself in Russophobia in the form of this this were fake testament of Peter the Great, as most probably familiar with, which was written in the end of the 18th century by a Polish general. He gave it to the French, actually, because he was meant to convince the French that the fate of Poland and Europe were the same. It effectively said the Russians would never stop. Well, the fake testament of Peter the Great, the Russians would never stop expanding. This was the logic. So this was used by the Poles to try to convince the French to effectively that we're all on the same side against these evil Russians. And indeed, when Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, as we know, many of the troops were not French, they were also foreign. So this was also important to have this European solidarity on this anti-Russian propaganda. And we saw the same during the Crimean War, by the way, in the 1850s. The same testament was referred to. That is, so we have to take the Russians now, otherwise it will continue. Adolf Hitler revived it again during World War II. Again, the same testament: we have to destroy the Russians now, otherwise they will consume all of Europe. Even President Harry Truman referred to this fake testament during the Cold War to explain this inherent expansionism of the Russian and how the West should respond. And we haven't seen it since referred to, but still the basic idea behind it, for example, in Ukraine, that if we do not stop the Russians in Ukraine, they will take all of Europe. This is it's the same logic. It suggests why we must all have internal solidarity, why we all belong to the same in-group. And it's all very reliant on having Russia as our out-group, which,
This thing, supposed thing by Peter the Great. So it says, oh, we intend to invade and take over Poland or something like that.
Yeah, and all of Europe.
And all of Europe. And is there controversy about how real it is?
Oh, no, that's established as a fake. So.
And when was it established as a fake?
Oh, that's a great question.
I mean, it's amazing that people have been citing it for so long. It's like raises this question of, are they just going against what's already established?
Well, it's a powerful. I don't think it's necessarily have to be rooted in truth. I think it's just a very powerful narrative, and it's also how human beings tend to organize. Against some of our most basic instincts is to seek security in the group, and what is defined as the in-group often depends on who your out-group is, which is why the Russians are very convenient or a very good out-group for us, because they have always been the perfect opposite. Again, you can only identify by something if there's another. You can identify as white if there's a black. You don't identify as having two eyes, because we all do. So you need an out-group. And the Russians have always, we have been the West and they've been the East. We have been the European, they have been the Asiatic. So there's a bunch of Orientalism, but these are like Asians in Europe, how they're presented. We are the civilized, they're barbarians, we're modern, they're backwards, we're liberal, they're autocratic, we're good, they're evil. So this is something that we also always recurred. And as I go through in the book as well, most of this us versus them has been to a large extent based on ethnicity, but that at least up to World War II. In World War II, you saw people like Churchill and Keynes referring to the beastliness of the Bolsheviks, or the Jewish and the Russian nature coming together effectively. But as the Cold War essentially translated this more into ideology, in which it was capitalism versus communism, Christianity versus atheism, and democracy versus authoritarianism. So it's so we recreated it to some extent after the Cold War. As now, whenever we talk about Russia, every single story will be through the lens of liberal democracy versus authoritarianism, and freedom versus imperialist ambitions, and to a large extent still the superior versus the inferior, which is not a healthy way of organizing the international system, because once you have a superior versus inferior, then the whole premise that you should look for common interest, peaceful solution, it tends to diminish.
Another point of double standards, or not, considering the shoe on the other foot, that Cobden very much hits on, is that in their regional conflicts, Russia is portrayed as attacking, an innocent damsel in distress, and they don't consider what the various opponents, whether it's the Ottomans back then or Ukraine and its allies today, have done. So that would be another kind of reoccurring theme, right?
Yeah, that's something that I brought up in my book as well, because this is a fascinating way that the British covered this Russophobia when they wrote about this. They pointed out they looked really into this to the Crimean War from 53 to 56, because prior to it, the Turks or the Ottomans had been presented quite negatively. They were the aggressor, the Islamic force, which were terrorizing the Christian Greeks. So then, the Greeks was the goodie, the Ottomans were the baddies. But then what they point out is how the narrative was suddenly switched and everything was put on its head after the Crimean War began. Suddenly, the Ottomans were this damsel in distress, this innocent poor victim, and Russia was the beastly aggressor, and then the British and French could be this knight in shiny armor. So and this is often how it's portrayed. You need these three different roles: who's the aggressor, who's the victim, and who's the savior. And we create these roles in order to tell a powerful story and mobilize required resources and public support for whatever policies you want to carry through.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we get this Russophobia really starting in this period that Cobden writes in. Gleason points out that after the Napoleonic Wars, like you mentioned, some of the foreign people also joined in the fight against Russia. But then the baton, in a way, at least in terms of Russophobia, passes especially to the British, and that this Russophobia takes deep root for whatever reason, and persists, and then revives in the 1850s with the Crimean War. So do you want to just, I don't know, maybe narrate a bit and bringing it, because there's so many interesting phases here. We get later into the Soviet period, and the Cold War, and then of course there's the post-Soviet period, and then there's the more recent period. Is there some kind of trajectory of Russophobia that you can tell us about?
Well, it's interesting that it suddenly fired up so very powerfully in the 1830s. And I also cite this interesting article in the Chronicle, which called for ending, well, it was calming down the Russophobia, because effectively it said, let's not succumb to irrational fear and hostility. We have to keep an eye on the Russians, and if they threaten us, we should confront. but we become ridiculous, and this is the word ridiculous if we continue to obsess about the threats which do not really exist there. Now, why did it occur in the 1830s? There's, I guess, different views on it. Well, one of them would be that the French, their primary other adversary, had of course been the French for well over 100 years, but this Russia defeating Napoleon, and this was a strange victory for the Russians, because yes, they defeated Napoleon, but then they ended the rivalry between the British and the French, as evident in the Crimean War. So the other was no longer the French, but someone more different, which is important for our ideology. Of course, when the British went against the Germans, they also had similar ways of framing them. So very brutish, referred to as the Huns, just a very beastly, uncivilized horde. But the Russians were even more so, because they had 2.5 centuries under Mongol occupation. They were seen as being more Asiatic, even further distance from the British. But from the 1830s, I think what is interesting is who challenges the British Empire or British dominance. And I think that this was, it had always been a rivalry over controlling the seas. That's typically how it's been. But as we saw then, Russia began to be this land power, which for that reason was also seen as being very backward. But through Russian expansion, it began to suddenly reach out to the maritime periphery. So it suddenly threatened the British Empire in a way it had never been threatened before, because no longer could it use this huge navy to defeat adversaries and restore dominance. Instead, they saw the Russians expanding from the core of Eurasia out to the periphery. And you saw this, a key concern obviously was with Turkey, as the Russians were moving closer to Constantinople, or Istanbul today. They also had, when they finished around 1828, they had a war with Iran. The British didn't come to the aid, and the Russians won. And afterwards, the Iranians start to recognize the Russians as the regional power, which depleted a lot of focus on the British. So overall, you saw the Russian increasing their influence towards the Mediterranean, Persia, Ottoman Empire, and also then expanding possibly through Central Asia, something that happened then more vigorously after the Crimean War. But this also threatened then to reach British India. And this is when you saw the theories of Mackinder from these ideas being born, because Mackinder effectively had this theory that the British had built their liberal empire based on controlling the seas, and suddenly came this brutish land power, which was expanding from the core to the periphery. And this is why it had the great game through the 19th century, but also when the Russians reached the Pacific and began to expand down to Port Arthur, it showed that the British were losing a lot of influence. This was, of course, after the Crimean War, when you had more railroads, and the whole idea was that transcontinental railroads would offset the competitive advantage of controlling the seas. So effectively, I think the geopolitics began to shift more in the 1830s, simply because Russia was starting to push more. After defeating Napoleon, began to then also push more out to the periphery. Ironically, for the Russians, they actually thought this as the ultimate prize for being accepted as Europeans, because the British especially always dismissed them as being true Europeans. But by taking back Constantinople from the Ottomans, they would then get back the ancient capital of Christianity. Also, the Russians would then establish themselves as a Mediterranean state, effectively reversing everything ever since Kievan Rus collapsed, and they would be a maritime power, center of Christianity. They would be then accepted as a European power. This was also seen as this also pointed as an argument by Dostoevsky, by the way, but which is why the Russians saw it as such a great betrayal when the Brits and the French actually supported the Ottomans against the Russians. But anyways, that was the geostrategic issues. I think there was also more obvious ideological issues. As you mentioned with the Corn Laws, the ambition to become a liberal empire, one based on, well, a free trade empire, which draws its power based on its comparative advantage in international markets. It prided itself of liberalism or free trade, openness, constitutional monarchy, and it was confronted then with Russia, which was seen as the opposite, a more autocratic, and someone which essentially threatened the overall world order, which the British represented. So all in all, I think they became the perfect other opponent of Russia, which meant that it's more easy to succumb to extreme propaganda and even phobia. So and often people say, well, phobia is there's reasonable. There's not unreasonable to be afraid of Russia, but again, this lies in the word of a phobia. It's irrational fear. So there's many rational reasons to fear Russia, as Cobden pointed out as well. But we have to address Russophobia, which is when the irrationality of the fear begins to take over. Because then, if our fear becomes based on irrationality, we're not acting rational.
Yeah.
If we're not acting rational, we can't act in our own national interest. And this is where the opposition comes to Russophobia. It's not some claim that the Russians are innocent angels and we have nothing to fear.
Yeah. Just on the word Russophobia, like you say, phobia emphasizes the notion of fear, but in a way, the fear is downstream of a hatred. In other words, the fear to a great extent is a false fear and is generated. And so the underlying thing is more this hatred or opposition driving the creation of fear. You see what I'm saying? I guess, I mean, you can have phobias that don't have this underlying, like if I'm afraid of spiders, if I have, fear of spiders, I have a phobia, it's not the same thing underneath as Russophobia, which is really like a political, agenda that then gets turned into a fear publicly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does.
Okay. Yeah. That's why I think in a way it's more about Russia hate underneath everything than about Russia fear. Because in some ways, I don't think the fear is that real. And indeed, it's maybe not as real as it should be as nowadays.
Yeah, but if you have a rational fear, this fear would derive from discussing Russia's interest. To what extent do their interests collide with ours? And this is where rational fear comes. But when this fear becomes irrational, driven by hatred, is if you're not discussing their interests. And this was also point of Cobden, which is we're not discussing what Russia. What its actual interests are. Instead, we were talking in these cliches, like we're giving them, assuming that they're forever expansionist to explain what they're doing. One would use, less now than in the past, but then would use references to animals in order just to make it sound like this just a beastly, evil compulsion to always push forward. And I think this is the main problem, and this is also what we see today. And I always make this point that in international politics, it's really the security competition which comes first. If you want to have any analysis, how do we try to enhance each other's security at the expense of the other? But we never do this, and this is fascinating. That if you want to know what Russia does, first you have to know what it sees as the main threats to its security, and then you can explain how it reacts. And this is how I've attempted to explain, for example, the war in Ukraine. But this is simply impossible because you will not find a single newspaper or or a news show which will discuss Russia's security concerns. What are the legitimate security concerns of Russia? It's completely absent. Instead, we're explaining Russia by using this, oh, well, they're the new Hitler, they want to restore the Soviet Union. We never explain what exactly these things mean, but it's all these cliches with the underlying assumption being that everything's happening in a vacuum. It's all evil intentions, it's all belligerent, and by definition is something that we can't cooperate with. We can't make peace. And this is why I've also argued that this propaganda is, that this Russophobia is to a large extent a product of propaganda. And as Walter Lippmann said, because he observed the civil war in Russia and the British media covering it, and he was also quite concerned about the British propaganda, because he argued, yes, when they did this propaganda presenting everything as a struggle between good and evil, it was always great to mobilize British resources and public support for war. But whenever workable solutions appeared, they would be rejected because they couldn't make this peace with evil. And it was the same with the Germans in the First World War. It helped to demonize their adversary. It's good to mobilize the resources, but once it was time to do peace, no peace was available, because you can't do really peace when this is a war for democracy, the war that would end all wars. And furthermore, once they were actually defeated, it was such a punitive peace, so much punishment that it laid the foundation for another world war. So it's so this hatred, this fear, it's not in our interest. We should.
Sure.
I always tell my students, don't hate your adversaries, because it results in poor analysis, which will produce poor policies. You should respect your opponent. Clearly, if you're not able to define the interest of your opponent, then you're in a very weak spot. And I think it's very difficult for the average person in the West now to explain what is the Russian position. Because we're being kept fed this notion that in very simple term, they're driven by evil, effectively, and this is where the hatred comes in, which doesn't help us at all in any way.
Yeah. So I got a question, kind of moving towards the Soviet period more. Do you think that the experience the Russians had prior to the Soviet, prior to 1917, of the West treating them badly, Russophobia, that somehow helped actually pave the way for the Bolshevik success? So in other words, if the West and Britain had been more friendly and neighborly about Russia, that sort of anti-West / anti-liberal, because the West is associated with some of many notions of liberal, would have fared better. In other words, socialism and communism wouldn't have gotten the traction that it got if the West had been friendlier to Russia. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, well, that's been a common argument, well, not just with Russia, but any country where we intervene in general, that nothing brings a country so much together. And keep in mind that during the Russian Revolution, the British were attacking up in Arkhangelsk. They used chemical weapons. They set up concentration camps there. The Americans as well, they came in from the east through Vladivostok, the Expeditionary Force, whatever. Anyways, it's nonetheless interference into their civil war, and they actually had the opposite effect to some extent, because if they were supporting the whites against the reds, then suddenly the whites were the one cooperating with foreign power invading their country. So, and overall, it's as Churchill, he told the House of Commons that it's Bolshevism is a disease. We have to strangle it in the cradle, or something along those lines.
Yeah, but I see that point, and that's a great point. But what about just the run up, like before there is a Bolshevism, the generation of the popularity of communism, Bolshevism, because the West has given the cold shoulder and mistreated Russia. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but that is something, that's another historical phenomenon, because when back in the early 1700s, you had Peter the Great. He really wanted to Europeanize Russia. So this was everything. It was establishing them properly on the Baltic Sea, everything from clothes to beards and the culture. Even the written language was made more European by having Dutch. What do you call them? Anyways, the Dutch writers assist in changing language. So they had an entire cultural revolution. They kind of obsessed with becoming more European, and this was part of the path. And for me, I've compared this to the 1990s, because they effectively wanted to be as much close to Europe as possible. And to some extent, we wouldn't take yes as an answer, because it was positive that they wanted to be closer, but you couldn't allow this huge country with this huge people to be able to just march in. So what we did then, as well as we did in the 90s, was effectively create this. Perpetuate their position as an object of security, if you will, because they were not civilized enough to be a part of us. So they could either accept this role as a civilizing object, one which would accept that we would rule, and cooperation would be the Russian implementing our decisions. So one-sided concessions. And they could either accept this role as the student while we're the teacher, or they could oppose it. But if they oppose it, they also oppose civilization itself and democracy and liberalism, which means then they have to be contained. So at no point did we offer the Russians this role as sit at the table, one amongst equals. So this was something that that annoyed back in the early 18th century. And keep in mind that as a result of these policies by Peter the Great, you also had the Slavophiles emerging as an opponent, and this was even the Dostoevsky's argument that why have we, well, then it was for 200 years, but now almost 300, well, now 300 years, why have we involved ourselves so much in Europe? Why we've been joining in on their fights? They don't even consider us to be Europeans. We are slaves to them. We should. This has been since Peter the Great. This has been a failure. We should really be looking east instead. In Asia, we would be masters in his words, but in Europe, they will never accept us. So let's leave Europe. This is enough. Like we gave it 200 years. Now it's 300 years, and yes, this has been a very central theme in Russia. That the Europeanization has never been welcomed by the West. So.
Yeah, and so in rejecting the West, they might throw the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that some ideas that are especially Western are good ideas that some Russians wanted to take on board, but probably got swept up with the rest of the bathwater. We had Paul Robinson on to do Russian liberalism, and he talked about some of those. What's the guy's name? Chicharov is one of the Russian authors, the Russian liberals that we reproduced in our journal.
But it's also worth seeing why Russian liberals then hasn't done well, and that's also part of this relationship with the West, because the Russian liberals would like to be more like the West, but because the West doesn't accept Russia as a seat at the table, they often liberalism manifests itself often in a treasonous way, and you saw this in 1825 with this when they had this coup attempt against the Tsar. This came from the experience in France, and overall you see this same. The same logic. So whoever's the treasonous one, if you read the Karamazov brothers, for example, Smerdyakov was pointing out, Napoleon should have defeated Russia because a smart country would have defeated a stupid one and annexed it. And this inferiority, liberals effectively buy into some of this inferiority, that they are the teacher, we're the student, we have to to follow them. That's why you see often Russian liberals in 1905 they congratulated the Japanese emperor after defeating and humiliating Russia. You still look at the who was the foreign minister of Russia under Yeltsin. I forgot his name now. Andrei. Anyways, he lives in Miami now. So he so at the top of the Russian government in the 90s. Now lives in Miami, spends most of his time on Twitter arguing that America should send more weapons to kill Russians in Ukraine. So this is how they often see the liberals, that they are effectively taking the side of the West against the Russians. So this is one of the reasons why liberalism has often been seen more as almost treasonous, because until recently, I would add, in the last few years, you've seen more liberals
it's
suddenly
Russian
emerging.
treason. It's
Yeah.
Russian treason.
Yeah, but now you see actually a huge change now. I see some liberals coming up saying, well, we're not the West is not our friend, but we should have more liberal ideas in organic liberal ideas. So this is something different than the liberals, which essentially pled loyalty to the West over Russia. So.
Well, this is a big story, of course, of all the ways in which the term liberal meant from meaning what Adam Smith meant to meaning something the opposite of what Adam Smith meant. So just using the word liberal is like, fraught with these difficulties. But yeah, I follow you. So it's very interesting you say that the 90s and perhaps early 2000s are a little bit like Peter the Great, where Russia is actually trying to be friends and trade with the West, and the West won't take yes for an answer. And then since then, Russia so much is used as the bad guy, like you said, and we have so many things blamed on Russia. Like it's an incredible pattern of American politics for Russia to be the source of some thing that people feel needs explaining. Can I ask you, can you make some kind of list of things in the last decade or 15 years that have been blamed on Russia in the West?
Oh, I would need plenty of time. Well, we can begin with the Russiagate, I guess, and actually, because we had a former Russiagate before. Keep in mind, in Britain in the 1920s, you had the rise of the British labor movements, and they didn't care for this. So how do you crush the labor movement? Well, you tell that your political opposition is actually working with the Russians, the people you hate the most. And so at this time they created this fake letter from the head of the Communist International, and in which he ordered the Communist Party of Britain to engage in all the subversive activities, and it was fake, but it of course it crushed the Labour Party, and it was proven to be a fake, by the way. But nonetheless, this is how that opposition was crushed. Now we learned the same from Russiagate as well, as we later learned from Hillary Clinton. This whole Steele dossier, which is set up, it was paid and ordered by the Clinton administration, and it was intended to destroy the Trump campaign, because they identified linking him as a Russian agent would effectively be the best way to sink him. Even the head of the, I think it was a CIA or NSA, had meetings with Obama, notes which has also been published, which shows that they warned already back in June of 2016 that this is how they're going to go after Trump. Try to fake a connection to Russia. So all this hacking, all this hidden servers, all of this was fake. But it was quite powerful nonetheless. And you had all this people from the intelligence community coming in and saying, no, of course he has Putin owns Trump effectively, and we keep looking for the collaboration. Where is the hidden ties? And so 4 years, his entire presidency gets almost consumed by just trying to prove that he's not a Russian agent. And then I think it was again repeated in 2020 with that election. As we saw then, you had this Hunter Biden laptop coming out. it criminates not just Hunter Biden but also Joe Biden in the middle of the election. Just a horror show, and then you had this 50 former intelligence people, and they sign a letter that this is clearly Russian disinformation, and this is pushed through by the media, and as a result, social media, newspapers, they put full censorship. And then, I mean, Twitter did full censorship. They even knocked down the account of New York Post, and no one could share any of this information, like full censorship. And then a year after, it's proven, oh yeah, no, it wasn't Russia after all. It had nothing to do with it, and the laptop was real. But of course, then the election is over. They also wanted to present Trump as being weak. So what did they do? They said, well, the Russians have put what do they call them? Bounties on the heads of American soldiers in Afghanistan, and you had all the Americans like Condoleezza Rice or up in arms saying we should go out and assassinate the Russian generals. Schiffy said it's better to fight Russia over there in Ukraine than over here. That was back in 2020. So all this rhetoric, and of course it was proven to be fake as well. It didn't happen. The election was won, and they start to walk it back because obviously there would have been some little bit of evidence if this was actually the case. And actually, a nice false flag one is also the Nord Stream pipeline, which for me was fascinating because it just shows what you can get away with if there's enough hate against another country, because you build up all this hate and you can use that as a currency. Because the United States, they had put sanctions on European firms which had built the pipelines. They had many American leaders had threatened the pipelines, including Joe Biden himself. Then it was blown up. And you had people, again, the top politician Blinken, everyone celebrating it in front of camera, saying what a great opportunity is. And still, they said, no, all evidence point towards Russia, which makes no sense. Why would they blow up their own pipeline when they can just turn it off? But then the United States and NATO used this as an excuse to militarize, further escalate the war in Ukraine, and also for NATO to begin to militarize more the Baltic Sea, to claim NATO must control all of these seas because God knows what the Russians are doing beneath the sea. And, skipping over all this, rejections of independent investigations, all the latest thing that happened was obviously the narrative fell apart, maybe because of Hersh, but now the United States tries to throw Zelensky under the bus, saying, yeah, Zelensky did it, as they say in the Wall Street Journal. We tried to stop him before he did it, but, unsuccessful. And then for me, this is fascinating because it's an admission that we knew before the pipeline was blown up that it wasn't Russia. And still, we lied to our own publics, we lied to the entire world that it was Russia, and then we used that lie to escalate the war in Ukraine and to militarize further the Baltic Sea. Now, this is very much by definition a false flag operation, and still, when you open you would expect this to be a huge scandal. When you open every newspaper, this will be front page thing that they lied to us to escalate a war, but it's not, because when you have that much hate against another country, you can't really criticize it, because then you can always be seen, well, if you're criticizing our side, that means you're leaning towards the Russian side. Now you might be taking the Russian side, and nobody wants to be seen as being on the Russian side. So you open the newspapers, nothing, like it didn't happen. Some even suggest, perhaps it was the Russian after all. It's completely, it's quite extraordinary. Anyways, I think Russia can be blamed for anything these days. And in my book, I use a lot of this weird examples of of everything that has been weaponized. They said, if a whale comes up which we don't recognize, they said, oh, it might be a killer whale sent by the Russians, trained by Putin. It's just quite extraordinary.
Yeah. By the way, one other example to put on the list might be, I just heard a little bit from Alex Cristofaro the other night about Walter Burns in the New York Times being quoted or something to the effect that Russian agents are somehow organizing mass migration from Mexico.
Yeah.
So somehow Russia's responsible for the immigration crisis.
Yeah, but There's sillier examples in French newspapers. They had a bit of a spread across Paris, this new aggressive bed bugs around the furnitures and beds, and then yeah, this might be Russian hybrid warfare because this is what Russia does now. It puts
Yeah.
bed bugs in your beds. I mean, it's just it's
Yeah.
obscene, but we come up with these terms like hybrid warfare, and then Russia can be blamed for everything. I mean, I've cited this different U.S. publication who accused the Russians of weaponizing, social media. They're weaponizing humor. They weaponized protest. They're taking advantage or intensifying Black Lives Matter. They're weaponizing sports and racism and corruption. They weaponized Eurovision as well. One article will tell you, and weaponizing history. It's weaponizing, as you said, migration. They're weaponizing finance. They're weaponizing environmentalism, so we won't have enough energy. They're weaponizing culture and gaming, and
Yeah.
they're weaponizing metaphors is another article.
Mhm.
So it's anything bad that happens, it's probably the Russians, and it's a it's a great way also for political leaders to have no accountability at all, because whenever something happens, if you say, well, it was the Russians, no one can really go against it, because if you say, well, surely you should have some accountability, no, then you might be seen as taking the side of the Russians. So it comes with a huge social cost. It's easier to nod and say, yeah, Russians might be behind the bed bugs. You don't want to come to the Russians' defense. So, but
Yeah.
it's also very dangerous because so many political leaders have been delegitimized as being almost agents of Russia. So, Bernie Sanders, Jill Stein, Tulsi Gabbard, Mitch McConnell, they call them Moscow Mitch, Rex Tillerson, Michael Flynn, all of these people. If you wanted to make them unacceptable to the media and make them disappear, then call them Russians. And
Yeah. I guess it's a way of just signaling to their networks, these are the bad guys.
oh yeah, it's a placeholder for bad guy, and that's also when you have whistleblowers, be it Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning,
Mhm.
suggests that the Russians are supporting them because suddenly nobody wants to touch them anymore. And it's the same for academics, by the way. If they call you, oh well, he's
Yeah.
a Putinist, he spreads Russia propaganda, no media will touch you anymore because now you might be giving voice to someone who's spreading Russian propaganda. So accusing someone of being in the camp of the Russians, it's very, very powerful, and
Yeah.
it
I'm
can be
sure.
abused.
Well, that prompts me to think about interesting questions I might have for you. But let me just ask you one about that. You have a great YouTube channel, and do you ever worry about being thrown off YouTube?
Um, yeah, well,
You want to
perhaps.
dodge that question? Okay.
No, it's well, the censorship increases a lot, but so far has been more limited to um, to demonetization and all. I don't monetize anything, so I'm okay. But it puts some limitations. For example, where I was in contact with Alexander Dugin about an interview, and this if you put that on Facebook, they might cancel your program. Also, I was in talk with some higher political figures in Russia, but that also, if they're put on a sanction list, they will also cancel your YouTube channel. Now, if you have like our interviews come out on the RAND platform, and it has more than 420,000 subscribers. If it cancels it, it's a huge cost. So it imposes restrictions. So it's no, well, one does have to worry about being cancelled. but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but it's also uh, it shouldn't dictate what you do either, because then
Sure. Sure.
you accept that this is normal. So
Yeah. Yeah. And there's always locals and so on. I subscribe to the Duran on locals. That's where I
yeah,
watch those. But
that's what started to do as well, to diversify a bit, because you have
yeah.
yeah, Duran is very good. They're on locals, BitChute, what do you call them?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Rumble,
Rockfin. Yeah.
Rockfin, yeah, all of this.
Rockfin, Rumble.
So
Alex is familiar words.
But this
Closing
is the
words.
channel of, by the way, this is a channel of Alex and Alexander. I'm just tagging along effectively. I suggested to Alexander we do some interview series, so it's not my channel, it's their thing. So
Yeah. You've given me a lot of time, and I'm very grateful. There's one other, if I could take one more, a little bit more minutes, or do you need to go? You're good?
no.
Just kind of like pulling back, and kind of getting to your more recent book, and you can keep this brief. We can try to keep this brief. But big themes that I've picked up in the last couple of years, because I'm just an economist and intellectual historian. I hadn't been following this stuff until I started to see how all of this stuff mattered to politics domestically and so on. So is great power politics, and the idea that great powers sort of have their own standing and in a way right to do things that non-great powers would be wrong to do, I guess you could say, and how you need to see symmetry, shoe on the other foot, and all of that. And so that's a big part of the bigger picture. And this is getting at the bigger picture of like what really is underneath all of this Russophobia. And then also, what you've taught me about Westphalia and the equality of sovereignty, and how there was a time then, 1648, Treaty of Westphalia, a notion, a kind of understanding of equality of sovereignty, and how that has really been departed upon, and how the rules-based international orders is a complete contradiction of that. It's basically you be our vassal, you be our student, and us the teacher, or us the kind of lord. And so do you want to talk a little bit about this whole equality of sovereignty from Westphalia and just how that relates to where we are today?
Yeah, sure. So after the 30 Years' War, you have what was recognized then was that none of the powers could essentially win and establish dominance, because as soon as one started to lead, the balance would shift against it. So it didn't matter if you're Catholic or Protestant, nobody would like to be dominated by anyone. So even on the value aspects or religious aspect, the countries were willing to form more pragmatic alliances to prevent a hegemon from emerging. So as Europe was just killing itself, the solution was we can't restore effectively a new Holy Roman Empire as it was, one which has full hegemony and also which can refer to a source of legitimacy to rule over all, such as the Catholic Church, simply because this was gone. So the solution then became what is effectively the modern world order, which is a world of balance of power, so many centers of power. If anyone tries to assert dominance or hegemony, then the others will balance it. And something that strengthens the sovereignty aspect is also when they claim to have is a focus on national distinctiveness. So we're all distinctive. So back in the days, for example, the French might appeal to universalism to rule a bit over the Germans. So this is also had to come to an end, even though this French universalism happened afterwards, of course. But the problem is after the Cold War, there was this was a very unique time in history. Suddenly, there was only one center of power in the world, which was the United States, and it also devised a security strategy based on hegemony. So, if you read the 2002 security concept, it's very explicit. As security and stability depends on no actors or group of states being even having the ambition to challenge the US. We have to be that dominant. And this was the source of stability. It mitigated the international anarchy as effectively was a world policeman. And then, but in a world of hegemony, where one state dominates, you can no longer base it on sovereign equality. Because if you're going to have a hegemon, by definitions, a hegemon has sovereignty, the others do not. They can either be allies, which subordinates to some extent, or they can be adversaries, which are weakened. But there's not that many other options. So this is problematic because international law is, according to the United Nations, is based on sovereign equality, so mutual constraint. after the Cold War, we don't want mutual constraint. We want to enable ourselves. So you have, democracy promotion, humanitarian interventionism, global war on terror, something which we preserve our sovereignty, but others do not. And it's in this framework that we gradually sees this rules-based international order coming forth, which is effectively an amalgam between international law and humanitarian law, because we establish two sets of principles. So a good example I usually use is, if a group of people want to secede from a state, do you respect the territorial integrity in accordance with the UN, or do you go with the humanitarian principles of self-determination? Now you have two sets of rules, and the rules-based international order is effectively no rules. You can pick which one you want to go with.
Yeah.
So in Kosovo, we say, well, never mind the UN. We need, humanitarian ideals. Well, let's have a self-determination. In Taiwan, we might also go with self-determination. If we would have broken up Iraq or Syria, we would also have gone with this principle. But when it comes to South Ossetia or Crimea, then no, it's not accepted at all, and we contest it, and we say no. Here, United Nations, UN rules, the UN matters, and this is because the humanitarian rule, because it's based on liberal ideals, it's a clause of exception for the West and the United States. We have this exception for us, but the Russians can't simply say that Crimea should be allowed to have self-determination. It's not appropriate because this is effectively our our value, and this is why the Chinese and the Russians are so fiercely opposed to the rules-based international order. They say we won't have it because it doesn't actually consist of any rules. Show us the rules.
Yeah.
And
the rule is do what we say.
Yeah, that's effectively it. You create two sets of rules in terms of whether or not the sovereignty can be respected, and then you pick and choose. And what we choose, it tends to be based on power interest, not actually facts on the ground. I know people try to often almost manufacture why there's differences. Obama did this. He pointed out the difference between Crimea and Kosovo was, in Kosovo we had, during the referendum there was for secession there was OSCE, you had all these international observers. In Crimea there was not. But this was all fake. There was never any referendum in Kosovo. They just seceded. So he just made up an entire referendum which never existed. But again, what are our journalists going to say? Are they going to say that Obama lies? That when was this date? When was this referendum held? It never was. But no one's going to contest him, because then it sounds like you're taking the side of the Russians. So it's just we stay loyal to the narrative, and never mind reality. And I think again, if we did this to someone else, it might be more challenging. But the hate fueled towards Russia makes it very difficult to hold any politicians accountable when they lie.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll end it. All of this raises the perennial question of, let's assume like you're basically a wise man and have good judgment and you're right. Why, what is behind it? Like how do you explain the lack of virtue? Is it vanity? Is it greed? But we won't go there. That's always the big question about, these big disagreements that we find. So anyway, Glenn, if you would, I'm going to stop the recording, but stay on for a second.
Yeah.
But thank you very much.